Hi, I'm Sanyin Siang, and I'm the Executive Director of the Coach K Center on Leadership and Ethics at the Duke University Fuqua School of Business, and I'm also a professor over with the Pratt School of Engineering. And today we have such a treat for you. I am here with one of my favorite people, General Marty Dempsey. So General Dempsey has served in multiple ways for our nation. He has been the 18th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the highest military office in all of our nation. And he is also the chairman of USA Basketball, helping our basketball team, national basketball team, continue to win on the national stage. He is also a senior advisor to Adam Silver, who is the commissioner of the NBA. So when we think about the lessons that we learn from sports and from military, there's no one that is in the unique position that General Dempsey is in who can share those remarkable lessons. So here we are. So General Dempsey, my first question to you is, for those who know you, what would they say are your superpowers?
For
Don't
those
be
who
humble.
Well, I was going to say, can humility be a superpower
Absolutely.
if you describe it as a superpower?
Yes.
No, I think that what I would like them to think, you know what I mean? I mean, if I could project to them something that they would then return to me, I would like it to be that I led with everyday courage, not episodic courage, not courage that occurs only in the most difficult of circumstances, but everyday courage, and even more important, Sanyin, that I could help others develop and live a life of everyday courage. There's a lot of things that make life a little challenging for us, and they don't always have to rise to the level of crises before they're troubling. And so, I think if I have a superpower, it's that I do try to live a life that is reflective of everyday courage.
Well, as someone who knows you and someone whose superpower is identifying other people's superpower, I'm going to share with you, from my point of view, one, humility.
No,
That's
thanks.
something we learned from you, the willingness to allow others to change your mind. Your deep sense of curiosity is another virtue superpower. And that courage, for sure, because you are someone we can always trust to do what is right, even in really, really hard times. But I'll also add
You're kind.
that you have relational superpowers. Those relational superpowers and analytical superpowers include the ability to make us think about things and ideas in fresh, new ways, so that we can imagine and take things to the next level. So grateful to you for that. Now, General Dempsey, you have represented America on the global stage in multiple ways, in the military and also in sports, with the Olympics and USA Basketball. For Veterans Day, what makes you most proud to be an American?
I think, and you're right, I have been honestly blessed to represent my country in military uniform for 41 years, and now I'm just finished up my 8th year representing our country as part of USA Basketball. And I like to think that what really sets us apart, I mean, there's many things, but the one I'm probably most proud of is that first of all, we love to win. We're very competitive. We're relentless about it. We put in the work. But I think we also understand that it's not just what we accomplish, but how. I mean, there's a lot of other examples around the world where, particular nation and particular groups of people might accomplish something, but they may not care how they accomplish it. They may not care how it affects others. We have a real deeply held sense of responsibility, and sometimes politically it can be criticized. We worry too much about what happens elsewhere in the world to the exclusion of our well-being. But I actually think that's what makes me most proud, is that we care, not just what happens to us, but what happens to others. And sometimes we execute that a little better than at other times, but that makes us completely human, it seems to me. But I think it's that ability to think beyond ourselves, both domestically and internationally, that I'm most proud of.
Wow. As an immigrant, I know everything you say just resonates so much because it's the American generosity throughout history. Yeah. And that's what makes this the most amazing nation in the world. So you've been in the highest levels of military. You're also in the highest level of sports. And you've also been down in the weeds and details. What common lessons can we draw from both sports and military when it comes to leadership?
Well, in terms of the kind of the responsibility for delivering outcomes that our fellow citizens expect of us, clearly in the military, winning matters.
Yes.
It's not enough just to put in the effort. We've got to put in the effort sufficient to make sure our country is safe and well protected. And in sports, we've had, especially in basketball, we've had a certain amount of success over these last several decades, actually. And what I take away from both of those things, because I've been part of both of them, crawling out of the shadow of Vietnam and living through some of the more difficult moments in our military in periods of malaise in the late 70s and early 80s, and climbing out of that. And then similarly in basketball, recognizing that we just can't roll the ball out on the court and expect to walk away with a gold medal. What I've taken away from that is the reality or the realization that it's hard to get to the top, and it's harder to stay there. And so, because we are the finest military in the world, and because we happen to be the finest, we've won 8 Olympic women's world gold medals, and we've won 5 Olympic men's gold medals consecutively. And the rest of the world is they're both catching up and they're trying harder. And so, one of the things that I think defines both the institutions with which I'm involved, and I suspect others that I'm not involved with, is that idea that you have to put in the work, you have to be accountable, and you have to be vigilant in order to maintain your position on top. And we are on top, and I believe we'll remain on top, but it just doesn't happen because we hope it happens.
Hope is not a strategy, right? But what I'm hearing from you, my key takeaways are, 1, relentless prep is what gets us to winning.
Yeah.
If we like to win, relentless prep in both military and sports is what gets to that win. But once you win, the first win is hard. The second and third win are even harder because others can copy. So it requires that imagination and that drawing from diverse points of views, and thinking through possibilities for the future. So let's talk about...
if I could add, because an Eisenhower quote just kind of resonates with what you just said. Eisenhower famously said, plans aren't worth anything. But planning is worth everything. So it's, we almost never execute the plan we believe we're going to execute. But it's the work that goes in and the synchronization and the thought that goes in planning that actually helps us achieve the results we do.
So General Dempsey, to build on what you just said, often we don't think about the creating space for reflection, for rest, to be able to get us even further than we are right now. And you, when you were chair of the Joint Chiefs, you brought all your generals and admirals to the Library of Congress for that reflection, to think about an object of meaning for them. So why is this practice of reflection so important to winning?
Yeah, I used to tell the combatant commanders, the other 4 stars in my life as the chairman, that they needed to create some white space on their calendar, because it's Very easy. And, obviously we could have a longer conversation about the influence of information technologies on our ability to think. But, we're tethered to information now in a way that we've never been before. And it's likely to with the advent of AI and all the things that it will likely bring, both positive and potentially negative, that could even be a bigger challenge. And yet, when we're in the business of executing, of accomplishing, we're not in the business of reflecting. You can't do both at the same time. And so when I was chairman, I recognized pretty quickly that my calendar would get away from me unless I asserted myself. And I hired a retired Coast Guard officer by the name of Sam Neill. You may know him. And I asked him to create for me a campaign of learning. That's what I called it. And the idea would be that he would take part in the calendar meetings, which we held every other week. And he had the authority to assert himself and give me time on the calendar to learn something, whether it was at the Library of Congress or a visit to the Fed chairman or a visit to the AT&T Operations Center in Morristown, New Jersey, or Silicon Valley, whatever it was. I asked him, I said, make sure I learn about something I really don't know right now. And he was unbelievable at it. And then Naja West, who you well know, she once came to me and said, General, in 2014, she said, we've got this thing that's beginning to crop up in West Africa called the Ebola virus. And she said, do you think you ought to know something about it? I said, the more important question, Naja, is do you think? She was my surgeon, my Joint Staff surgeon. Yeah. I said, do you think I ought to know about it and why? And she explained, about pandemics. And so I said, okay, get with Sam, put together a campaign of learning event. And we brought in to my conference room the CDC director, HHS, State Department, military, just a group of stakeholders in health. And we learned about what could potentially happen with this thing called Ebola. And so when it got bad, and as you recall, there was the first case that hit the United States was in Houston, and everyone really panicked a bit about how this thing might spread. And the president said to me at a meeting, what can the military do? I knew what the military could do because my team had taken me through it and given me the opportunity to learn about it. So in a room full of, Ivy League and the National Security Council, Ivy League educated cabinet members, all of whom said, well, what's Ebola? And I said, well, I'm glad you asked me that question. But my initials are MD, so it worked out.
Well, so that, I think, illustrates the superpowers we talked about in the beginning, the humility to recognize you don't know everything, the curiosity, that's a virtuous superpower to say, all right, what can we learn? And then the idea that we need teams. You were drawing on the CDC. You were drawing on other people who had a domain knowledge different than your own, and that was a team. So let's connect the dots.
Okay.
Information and also this idea of teams. The fog of war today isn't enough information. The fog of war is too much information, and that's creating a lot of chaos. The fog of war on the basketball court is constant variables and data. So at the same time, there's a tension with that need for quick, coordinated team to, in order to secure those wins. So what advice will you give for how leaders can manage that fog and also enable the team to move quickly?
Yeah. Well, I think you'd agree. It starts with the fundamentals, right? I can't tell you how many times I've watched the most elite basketball players on the planet spend hours on footwork. I recall Kobe Bryant in 16 when he was with us in Rio, having a personal trainer work with him an hour before practice, without a ball, without a basketball, just on his footwork, on how he would position himself to go around a screen. And actually there was an article written about it, and somebody, I think, a magazine article, and the author was with him and said, "Kobe, what are you doing? Why are you practicing footwork? You're the best basketball player on the planet." And he said, "How do you think I got to be the best basketball player on the planet?" Steph Curry does that. You saw what he did in this last Olympics. But what you didn't see was that whenever there was an optional practice, and we had them in Paris, and whenever there was a period of time after practice, when everybody else was getting on the buses, he would stay and he would shoot and shoot. And I don't know what he had in his head about when he would feel like he was, had done well enough to stop shooting. But he never stops practicing. By the way, which, hearkening back to your last question, which conflicts a bit with your other point about, well, if you're not doing anything but practicing, where do you find time to think? But I have seen, these elite athletes, and I've seen our military leaders, find the time to do both. But it starts with fundamentals. And then the second thing is, the next step is that leaders have to empower their teams. So whether it's a military team or a basketball team, they have to empower them to be agile. And what I mean by they have to empower them to be agile, when the play breaks down, when they come across the court at every level, even at high school level, when the point guard comes across the court, half court line, they call a play. Sometimes it's a hand and arm signal or a gesture, or they'll verbally call a play. I will venture to say that the play is actually run about 20% of the time, because the defense gets a vote. And if they have an instinct and have watched film and have played against you in the past, they know what you want to do, and they will disrupt it by their positioning on the court. And that's where players with a relationship to a coach who empowers them to be agile, know that they can then change the play in order to ultimately put the ball in the basket. And so it's that combination of fundamentals, which include individual fundamentals, but team fundamentals, and then the ability to be agile. And I say the ability because it's something that a coach has to underrate. He has to make sure they know that it's okay to be agile. And then the last piece is accountability. If it doesn't accomplish what you thought it would, you got to own it. Sometimes the coach has to own it, sometimes the player has to own it, but somebody's got to own it.
Oh my gosh, what you just, the word I'm thinking of is we're now in a motion offense world where it's a constant, it's fluid. So part of that agility among the team fundamentals is actually enabled by trust and trust building. So in your best-selling book, Radical Inclusion, which you co-wrote with our dear friend Ori Brofman, you talk about the need not only to empower your teams, but how to empower your teams through building trust and creating that sense of belonging. Can you share a little bit with us about how we build that trust? Yeah,
that's such a great question because it's the essence of leadership, really. I mean, a sense of belonging that leads to trust is absolutely necessary for any team to accomplish its mission. It is the single most important part of leadership. I like to think of when I think about how to get how to develop a sense of trust. The first thing I always remind myself is it's a two-way street. If I'm not exhibiting trust, why would I expect them to give it back? And I always feel like the leader has 60% of the responsibility, and then those entrusted to the leader's care, 40%. And I really believe that. So the leader has to start the process. Secondly, I found that the best way to develop a sense of trust is by giving those entrusted to your care memories, giving them memories. I often reflect on what it means to be a memorable leader. And the reason I reflect on it is, I'm blessed that if I'm walking through an airport and somebody says, "Hey, General Dempsey, we served together in Germany," and they'll always say, "And I remember this," or "I remember that." And it finally struck me after hearing that phrase uttered so often that they remember me in a way that may or may not be true, by the way. In other words, I may have been that leader, but even if I wasn't, that's the leader they imagined me to be. And because they imagined me to be it, they learned themselves, but they also trusted me. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, but you can only accomplish that if you give them something to remember. So how do you do that? There's a million ways to do that. You know, it could be an innocent, gesture. It could be a note, handwritten note. It could be a team building exercise. It could be you grabbing them after an exercise and explaining why it didn't go the way you wanted it to go in a non-demeaning, constructive way. Or sometimes it could be that they saw me blow my top and then realize I was blowing my top and kind of try to back it off. But if those entrusted to your care remember something about you, then they will trust you. What I always tell people is you can learn from positive leadership and should. You actually can also learn from negative leadership. It's unfortunate, but you can. What you can't do is learn from mediocre leadership. If a leader doesn't care what his subordinates think about him or her, or if they're just neglectful and don't put in the time, and how sad would that be, by the way? But it happens that this idea of mediocre leadership is not memorable. So I would say, to land the plane, if you will, I would say you build trust by giving people memories.
Oh, that is so profound. And you've given me so many memories, and so many members of the Cole team, the Coach K Center Leadership and Ethics and Duke University teams, so many memories. And one of my favorite memories that stuck in my head is the Make It Matter memory. Can you share that? Because I think for our audience, that is a beautiful memory, and that speaks so much to what.
So this started not as a memory for. It didn't start out that I was trying to create a phrase for anyone else's use other than myself. And what I mean by that is, to fill in the context, in 2003 and 2004, we were taking casualties in Iraq. And as part of the process of honoring them and memorializing them, we had memorial services, and they've been not romanticized, but they've been. You've seen them on television. Yes. Where there's a footlocker and an inverted rifle, a helmet, dog tags, a pair of boots, and that would be and a picture probably, and then the memorial service would be led by the chaplain, the unit chaplain, and the remaining teammates of the fallen soldier would array themselves almost in congregational fashion, almost as you would see in a chapel. And at the end of the ceremony, the chaplain would speak, several of the soldiers would speak, company commander would speak, and then taps would be played, probably Amazing Grace would be played. And then the expectation was that the senior leader present you kind of go down the line of the soldiers, of the fallen soldiers, the teammates. So if there were 12 on patrol, they lost one, there's 11 there. And I found myself in those early days, not at a loss, but I wasn't happy with how I was engaging those soldiers. I felt like it was superficial. It was, come on, I'm really sorry for your soldiers, for your teammates' loss. Let's get out there. You know what I mean? I just didn't feel like I was connecting with. Maybe that's the word. I wasn't connecting with them. And then, one evening I had this phrase pop in my head: "Make it matter." It literally popped in my head at about 3 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't in the evening. It was in that period between asleep and awake. And then the next time I went to a ceremony, a memorial service, I walked up to the first soldier, shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "Make it matter." And I realized that what had happened, and I really can't explain how it happened, but I'm certainly glad it did, is that this phrase worked for me personally. In other words, I got 32,000 soldiers out here. I've just lost 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. And I've got to make that sacrifice matter, but I also can't lose sight of the fact that I've got a large group of men and women counting on me to get them through this and accomplish the mission. But it also worked for them, because what it said to them was, I can't change the outcome. I can't bring them back. I'm fearful and I feel guilty. This is the teammates. I feel guilty that it wasn't me, and I'm fearful because I got to go back out. And so me saying make it matter to them, and then you could see them kind of, after being kind of dazed by the experience of the memorial service, well, that's the challenge, right? That's what I got to do. I got to make this matter. And, off they would go. And boy, I was just so proud of them for being, compassionate, relentless, and resilient, all in the same human frame. Those are 3 pretty competing emotions, right? And Make It Matter was how that all started. So, I've really kept grasp of that phrase since then, since 2003. Even in subsequent assignments, I had a box on my desk engraved Make It Matter, and in it I had a card with the image and a little data about each of the soldiers I lost. And I carry 3 of them. I got 3 in my wallet right now. And then I have the other 129 in the box. And every once in a while I'll rotate it. But the top of the box says Make It Matter, and it's been on my desk through the time I was CENTCOM commander, TRADOC commander, chief staff of the Army, and chairman. Right there, where whatever I'm doing, I'm signing orders, and there it is, Make It Matter. So, but that's, there's a case where it is about giving a memory.
Yes.
The memory which says you can do something about this. You've had a terrible life experience, but you can do something about it. You can make it matter. You can, for somebody other than yourself. And so that's the story.
It connects back to the sense of otherness in the being proud to be an American, that it's making it matter for not only for ourselves, but for someone else. And it is about the sense of agency that is created by purpose. So if I were going to think about the key things I'll reflect on today, one is the power of curiosity and humility, which you have, and that's why you're a lifelong learner, and that's why every time we talk, for as long as I've known you, I always take away so many new learnings.
As I do, by the way.
And the second thing is this idea of everyday courage, and what we saw is this exhibited in this conversation. It's the everyday courage to do the right thing. It's the everyday courage to be authentic and to be vulnerable, and that's driven by also a lot of self-reflection, because when you reflect, you are in this middle of this dynamism between how you want to be seen, how you aspire to be seen, and how you aspire to be, and how the rest of the world sees you and your impact on the rest of the world. And I think that's the power of reflection. And it's also the power of preparation. And so much of it always comes down to this idea of team, believing in your people, caring. That's mediocre leaders don't care. Bad leaders and great leaders, there's a bit of caring in there.
Yeah.
So that caring for the role, caring for your responsibility, caring for the people, those are consistent themes I see throughout.
Yeah, and if I could just add, we've all seen leaders who enjoy the entitlement of being leaders, and it's such a missed opportunity, because the right frame for leadership is that leadership is a privilege. If you start with that it's a privilege to be a leader, then I think you're on the right path to do some of the other things we talked about.
Yeah.
But if it's just self-aggrandizement, then you're going to be that mediocre leader. You might get things done, but you're not going to. One last thing. I think it's the last thing. You're the boss. But,
I could listen to you forever.
No. But I used to say to I had the responsibility for evaluating dozens, really, maybe even over the course of time, hundreds of mid-grade leaders and even senior leaders toward the end of my career. And sometimes the leader with the best scorecards, the best maintenance results or the best training results or the fewest the fewest disciplinary issues. They were, I appreciated that they had high scores and all of those things. But when I would do performance reviews with them, I'd say, but you're down here, you're like 6 of 10, and they were aghast, and they'd say, what? How did I end up at 6 if I'm number 1 in all of those statistical categories? And I'd say, well, I'll tell you how, because I've taken the time to get to know your unit, your junior leaders, and you know what? Not one of them want to be like you when they grow up. And they would say, hey, sir, that's not true. I said, it is true. And from my personal observation, it's true. And I value the competence you bring to the job, but you're not inspiring anyone. And an all-volunteer force with all of the things we ask young men and women to do, if you're not inspiring them, you're not doing the job that not only I need you to do, what the country needs you to do. So you got to make sure they want to be like you. And if they're not, if you're not accomplishing that, you're missing some important part of leadership.
Oh, so that's a great metric, not only for leading in organizations, but also leading as a parent.
Yeah.
Where they parenting is an act of leadership. So we had such an amazing time today, General Dempsey. And like I said, every time I speak with you, I learn more from you. So for those who want to learn more from General Dempsey and his wisdom, 1, read his books, Radical Inclusion and No Time for Spectators. It will help you think about leadership in new and fresh ways. If you want to take a deeper sense of responsibility, be the inspiring leader that you want to be, read those books. I have also been a dedicated follower of his LinkedIn, where he would draw from history and put out quotes and reflections. And go to his website, www.generaldempsey.com, where he will also have articles and little reflections. And that's how, for now, we can continue to gain from your wisdom.
You're very kind.
Thank you, General Dempsey.
Thank you, Sanyin.